So just to give you a quick introduction, so Pete is an associate partner in McKinsey's operation practice based out of Chicago, also my hometown. He serves industrial clients on manufacturing and product development topics and does operational transformations and is a leader of Industry 4.0 in the firm. He's an MIT alum and a University of Illinois alum, also just like myself. So I'm really excited to hear his talk today. Thanks.
Cool. Well, hey, thanks everyone. Great intro, by the way. So today I'm going to speak a little bit about a partnership we entered into with MIMO, with Bruce here. We took a look at what's behind all the headlines with machine intelligence and operations, and we co-developed a survey, sent it out to a group of participants, and we wanted to get a sense of, if you're a leader in this space, what sort of returns are you getting? If you're new to the space, where are you struggling? And then, what's part of the secret sauce that the leaders are perhaps doing differently here that we can learn from? So we'll talk about some of the insights we saw from today, some of the headlines, and excited to share some of the results with you all today. All right. So here's the headline. When we surveyed about 100 companies, a little close to 200 respondents, we saw that the KPI improvements that the leaders are receiving here is on the order of 2 to 3x of what everyone else was when they were entering the space. And so we wanted to understand a bit more about what's behind the scenes here. And we looked at 20 key performance indicators, multiple categories of enablers, multiple business outcomes, and a lot of different use cases as well. And we supplemented the survey data with a series of interviews where the folks we got to speak to were surprisingly candid about what was working well for them, and then also where did they perhaps struggle a little bit. We looked at 3 groups of attributes to understand some of the drivers of success. Looked at results, the enablers, deployment, and after grouping the respondents, and we ran a clustering algorithm to find like groups of respondents, looking at leaders, people who are emerging early in their journey, laggards, as well as those that are planners. And after grouping them and looking at the leaders compared to the rest, there are really 5 categories that stood out the most. So it's around governance, deployment, partnering people, and data execution. And on top of it, we asked some questions around how much are the leaders actually investing in their performance or in their MI efforts. And from last year to this year, not only are they in a leading position, but they are also investing more heavily than the rest. And so we'll take a little bit of a look at that as well. So first, just a little bit of grounding, because whenever we send out these surveys asking about digital and analytics, we need to make sure that the participants are calibrated and what are we really asking about. So we built a bit of a framework here within a certain application, going from less sophisticated at the bottom to slightly more sophisticated at the top. We wanted to know, hey, who's deploying dashboards? What sort of KPI improvement are they receiving? And you look at descriptive analytics, predictive, prescriptive, and then machine intelligence. And bring it to life a little bit is like, let's say I have a pump or a motor. A digital report might say the pump is running or the pump is drawing this much current. Descriptive would say, okay, I've got a view now of averages of mean time between failures. So I'm doing a bit of analysis on my pumps. Predictive is, now I know that when the current spikes a little bit, I have a pretty strong correlation that, hey, this pump's going to fail soon. Prescriptive is saying, here's what you should do to fix it before it fails. And MI is actually taking a look at all the real-time data and historic data and developing patterns based on the algorithm without the user kind of directing what you're supposed to be looking for to trigger the event. So who completed the survey? We had a pretty good coverage here. So between the networks of MIT and McKinsey, hit a number of industries. It is a largely North American-focused data set, but good group of different industries as well as size of enterprises. So we felt like we were able to get an early representative sample in the first year that we issued the survey. All right, so what's at stake? Everywhere the leaders have chosen to play, they are eclipsing the performance of the rest. And I'll take a second here to walk through the chart because I know it's a little dense. So these were the 20 some odd performance indicators that we asked about among the respondents. And the way to read it is, in that clustering I described earlier, the leaders are the triangles, and this is what they self-reported in terms of their performance improvement by deploying analytics or machine intelligence in their operations. The square is the lower 50% of the group, so we clustered these separately. And you can see in like factory efficiency, we've got an average of 16% improvement across the leaders, and about 6% on the bottom 50%, which is still a good number. It's just trailing what the leaders are doing. And so we wanted to unpack this and understand what's happening. And frankly, we were pretty surprised the data came out this way. We didn't think that there would be this stark of a difference across the board in nearly every single category, 2 to 3x in a group of companies that are doing something that appears to be different from the rest. So those are the results. Those are the KPI impacts. Now let's take a bit of a closer look at what are some of the leaders doing different from an enabler point of view. So I mentioned the 9 enablers, right? So strategy, opportunity, focus, on down. And between the survey itself and the interviews, 5 stood out. And the way to read this one is top quartile performance within this enabler. So there were certain responses around like strategy where we asked, how well defined is your strategy? And if it's really well defined, then you would be in the top quartile. And if you said, I have no strategy at all, I'd be in the bottom quartile. So I'm scoring in the background behind this. And we bucketed the 4 groups: leaders, planners, executors, and emerging. I'll describe a little bit of like what characterizes these groups before we go into the enablers, because I think it's a pretty helpful means to bring it to life. There's this group of, not starting on the right, there's this group of just folks that are getting their feet wet. And they don't have much of a strategy in place. You can characterize them as still figuring out where they want to focus. And they don't have a lot invested in terms of people or technology or budget at this point. Then if you move to the left, you have a group of executors. And these are folks that have been really focused on what sort of business problems they want to solve and are often partnering in a greater way than even the planners. And they're driving a lot, substantial value. So you can see the results for an executor are actually pretty close to what the leaders were achieving. And we had a chance to talk with a few companies that would fall in the executor bucket. And what was unique about them is they often had like a C-level conversation on, hey, here's the business problem that I want to solve. I don't care how I solve it. MI is a tool in the toolbox. But if it was a leadership-driven imperative, a major value driver for the business, they felt like, hey, this is what we're going to focus our efforts. It could be process control. It could be reliability. It could be on-time delivery. Then you move into the planners, and these folks are doing a lot of the enabler aspects, right? But there are some differences with the leaders. You can see they're like a slightly lighter shade of blue around strategy, focus, governance, deployment. But they have a lot of people and money tied up in their data and their people development. So what we've done here is, we've got the 4 different groups. We think we have some good patterns that we've observed from the leaders themselves, and developed a bit of a point of view of like, hey, if you're in any one of these buckets, what might you want to think about doing differently to achieve the outcomes that the leaders are achieving today? So we'll start with governance. And this was fun to see as like an operational excellence or lean practitioner, where in the space, it was only the highest performing companies that said, hey, I actually continually refine and improve my processes on an ongoing basis. They're saying there's enough new happening in the space that I have to always revisit. Am I doing it the best way? Am I doing it the most efficient way? Am I actually getting the outcomes that I want and testing is my process robust enough to generate the outcomes that I want? It was a little bit more scattered for the rest, but this was one that was another kind of a surprise to us, that only leaders out of the entire data set said, I'm continually refining and improving my process when it comes to machine intelligence and analytics deployment. The other thing we wanted to take a close look at was like, what are folks actually doing? What are the types of use cases that you're deploying within across the groups. And we could see some pretty solid focus around forecasting, transportation, maintenance, and on down in terms of where the leaders were participating. The rest of the group was honestly kind of scattered. You could see some concentration around inspection and cycle time, but it was really pretty widely varied. Now, I think a word of caution, just because leaders are saying I do forecasting, transportation, and maintenance, it doesn't mean it's the right thing to do for everyone. I got to have a conversation with one of the participants in our survey, and when they first started out, they said, hey, everyone's doing predictive maintenance. And they're looking at a press, and they said, we know that when the wear components reach a certain life cycle, and I haven't changed the hydraulic fluids for a certain period of time, it's going to fail, but we want to get better. So they spent a couple months analyzing all the data that came off the press, and they ran their algorithms, they tested it out, and it told them that when the wear components reach end of life and the hydraulic fluid has reached a certain point, the press is going to break. It just wasn't the right response for them, and they really just confirmed what they already knew. So this is a word of caution there. Now, that's not to say it's always the case with maintenance. There's some really great applications in motors and pumps, and a couple other spots where we've seen this be really successful. But it's got to be a meaningful problem, one that you may not have under control already through another means. And I think you also have to be willing that maybe the first try is going to fail, because this same company came back and focused on a major business imperative and absolutely crushed it with their MI efforts. The other thing that was fun to see here was like the difference in the sophistication of the approach deployed. So if we describe dashboard as the simplest on the left-hand side, and then your descriptive analytics and predictive, descriptive, predictive, prescriptive, and MI going left to right, the darker the blue, the more frequently this type of company deployed that tool for that use case. And for those in the bottom 50% in their deployments, it's almost, it's all dark blues on the dashboards, right? Now, this isn't to say, like, if I do the more advanced technique, I get the better response. This is a correlation, right? But it's still fascinating for us to see that, like, the companies that are just doing dashboards, they're not getting the outcomes. One of the other observations here. Whereas the leaders are actually, it's not like they're fully concentrated on pure machine intelligence outcomes, but they do have a lot more going in areas like predictive and prescriptive, and much higher levels of machine intelligence applications than anyone else in the data set. And again, it was surprising to see across the board, across all the responses, that this level of consistency when we were having conversations with companies, as well as looking at the actual data and results. In my mind, when we started out this, I had this impression that folks that were really good at analytics and machine intelligence, they must have had just absolutely the top, the best internal development capabilities of anyone out there. And that might be true. They might have absolutely phenomenal internal capabilities, but they are partnering at a rate and with more entities that is greater than anyone else in our data set. So, same sort of chart as before. We have our leaders in the triangles compared to the rest of the group in the squares, and academia, startups, consulting, outside vendors. You can see the level of partnerships is actually much, much higher for the folks that are leading. And this was one that we saw a bit more in executors as well, because there are some, particularly in supply chain applications, there are some really top-notch analytics or more general purpose AI solutions that executors are using to be quite successful. When you get into some of the more bespoke challenges in a manufacturing operation, that's where, anecdotally in conversations with companies as well through the survey, that's where you tended to see more partnerships with academia and startups, where your line is unique enough that a general purpose solution just doesn't fit well enough, or you have to combine really deep domain expertise with the analytics expertise. Those are spots where some of the companies we spoke with said, hey, that's better for me to work with a startup that's really focused on this, or in academia where they're really focused on this, than it is for me to go work with a general purpose solution provider. The next one here was that really stood out to us was around, what are leaders doing well from an employee engagement and empowerment? And, it's getting repetitive. Like, they're doing more of a lot of these things, right? So you can see in the top bucket, it's around hiring and staffing complete data and machine intelligence teams, training employees, and applying MI to employee satisfaction. It's like we see in particular, like, folks that are doing really well here, they're hiring and staffing and training in roles that the companies just entering the space aren't even thinking about yet. So dedicated ML engineers or AI managers, in a way that you can see the bottom half of the group just at 8% in both of those. Just they're not thinking in that way yet. And this is this is a group that's been much more sophisticated in terms of how they're deploying, the roles they're hiring, and the access to information just across the board. We had a conversation with one company. It's in a big franchise model, and they found that they essentially were designing all their MI applications for their field employees, right? And so giving them access to more information about the location where they're operating in, what's selling well, what isn't selling well, like that center-led model where we develop the applications and then we empower the frontline to use it, was incredibly powerful for them. So one of the examples where we just wanted to bring it to life. So last piece here is around data availability. So can't be successful here without the right access to data. We'd see everyone's acquiring customer or supplier data. A lot of them are sharing it back and forth, so that collaboration across the supply chain has proven to be quite important. And then they're all empowering employees, again, as I mentioned before, with access to information, and in many cases, remote access to that. On the investing in data collection and storage, some of the groups have actually grown out of like a chief data officer's organization, and then they gradually moved into more analytics. It's like some companies' paths. There are multiple paths here, but just to reinforce the importance of actually making sure that the data is well organized, identified to be important, and properly curated as well. So, here's what the investment numbers look like for those that are doing well in this space. Mostly across the board between this year and next year, so the leaders group here, they're going to increase their investments. Everyone else is being pretty stable. So one of the things that we're trying to do with the survey is turned it into more of a longitudinal survey so we can track outcomes year over year. Is the gap going to grow in the leaders because they continue to invest? They've been able to self-fund, the flywheel, right? They've got capabilities. They seem to have the partnerships. They're getting superior outcomes overall. And kind of the call to action for the rest of the group is, are we doing enough in this space, or is the gap just going to continue to grow? How can we shortcut that? So I'll synthesize a little bit about what some of the implications for those that are just getting started on their MI journey here. So the companies that we spoke with that were really doing well in this space, they found out like they developed their North Star. So what is my future state organization going to be doing differently versus what I'm doing today? What is the really big problem that I need to solve in my operations? It's a business problem. Is it I need to focus on delivery? I need better supply chain resilience? Is it I need to improve process control on this line because I'm in a razor thin margin business and I need to improve the productivity of this line? But they align around what are those big problems to solve, and then think about MI as a tool to help go solve them. And it may not always be the right tool to solve the problem. Then they come up with a pretty honest assessment, like where are we in terms of in-house versus capability in order to be successful here. And there are different ways to go about like mapping out that starting point from where I am to where I want to go. Some companies have been quite successful in creating what they view as more of like a center of excellence internally. They can help identify if the vendor or the third party that they're about to work with is really providing something that's valuable and will work and is proven in the space. And then they kind of reserve their internal capacity for the real bespoke problems. But without knowing kind of where you are and where you want to be, it's a bit difficult to achieve. And then laying out the rough transition plan. So, what infrastructure do we need to start transitioning? What are some realistic medium-term targets? And frankly, making sure you're using your existing data to make decisions, right? Because we saw it's a bit in that continuous improvement slide among the first ones that I shared. You can see there's a mindset aspect to this, right? So if you aren't already using your dashboards to inform logical business decisions, then you probably want to start there before you invest all this time and money in a more sophisticated approach. Companies that were already making the most of the data that they had on hand, there's a kind of a common refrain when we interviewed some of these companies. And try to use the approach to self-fund it, right? So can you do some quicker wins, partnering with perhaps some more off-the-shelf solutions to prove out the value, gain more reps in deploying these tools, and then fund the additional infrastructure investments that you have to have along the line. I think there are many companies that are kind of stuck in that planning bucket where they've made a lot of investments, but they aren't getting the ROI yet. And the goal is like make sure that those investments are kind of self-funding so you don't get stuck into a place where you're not getting the ROI after all this investment that you've had. So these are a couple of the implications for the MI journey. And then I'll come back to this one, but is there a way to go back on? There we go. Say that for the end. But any questions? I think happy to discuss the survey responses, talk a little bit more about what we've heard or what's been successful.
Pete, can you talk a little bit more about the hiring, and when's the time to bring in the team? Because if you don't have people that can have the vision for what is possible, but you don't want to hire if it's not a right solution. So how do you get that people place? What's the right time to hire and the type of people to hire?
Yeah, I'll talk about one example where the CTO of a company we spoke with, they kind of like self-taught themselves a little bit just so they could spot what roles they wanted to start with. And then honestly, they partnered a lot up front to learn about what roles they wanted to have. And after the partnering happened and they started to absorb some of the knowledge from that, that's when they started to build out their own internal capabilities a little bit more. And this is starting from like square one where we don't have a single data scientist on staff or an MI engineer or analytics expert. A group of very smart and talented like technical process engineers on staff, but nothing within the data science space. So they partnered until they learned enough about what they were looking for and then started to recruit people into those roles.
Thanks very much for the presentation. And actually, I want to let you know that one of the reasons I came here today was because of reading that report that came out from McKinsey. It's really great. I do have actually two questions, if it's okay with you. The first one has to do with the definition of the scope of operations, only because it seems as if the majority is definitely focused on manufacturing ops, okay? But yet there were also things like product development, HR, and such. And I just wanted to get a flavor for you. Was definitely the scope around the manufacturing ops and the things that support it, because I didn't notice like things like financing or revenue projection, things like that. So could you just comment a little bit upon the different aspects of the organization that were included but not, and those that weren't?
Yeah, so for this survey, we focused on functions like manufacturing, supply chain, product development, and procurement a little bit, from initial sourcing through customer delivery. Now, in terms of like training and developing people within those functions, we did ask some of those questions, but we didn't look at use cases around claims process automation or fraud detection in this effort.
Okay. The second one, and this is a little bit deeper question, it was something that I believe I picked up from the actual report. It's a little bit deeper in there, and because it talked a lot about best practices of what makes a good POC, proof of concept type of effort. And in it, I thought there was at least one point where it had this interesting discussion about the type of methodologies actually used for the POC relative to deep learning versus traditional machine learning or rules-based or physics-based modeling and interpretable like ML. And there was a conclusion, or I thought there was a conclusion, that actually some of the leaders progressed more quickly by employing deep learning methodologies as for their methodology. They like didn't worry about the fact that the domain experts weren't necessarily getting a say or seeing inside of the actual algorithms. Could you, if I misinterpreted that, please correct it for everybody here, but I just thought it was a fascinating discussion.
I think the example was real-time process control in that one. And so one of the things that they need the domain expertise for, so there was some domain expertise. They need the domain expertise to figure out what data am I actually going to pull off the line to feed into my models, because this was like a highly complex extrusion process with a number of organic materials that varied and produced high speed with thousands of SKUs. And so the controls engineers, like, they could solve a specific SKU and get close to what the ML model could do in a couple, I think it was like 1 or 2 months. But then the ML model, after it trained itself, could do the same thing in a couple days. And so they had to figure out what data was actually going to come off the line and be processed, because there's too much information. But then in those sort of like situations where there's no like deterministic solution that you can get to, that's where the ML models, I think, really shined for them, because it was able to figure out, well, I understand enough to do real-time process control and correct the process every 10th of a second or so, versus waiting a couple months for some very talented engineers to figure out the solution using MATLAB and other formats. But Bruce, I think that was probably the example, right?
Cooper Standard. They came and spoke at our PhD level research forum that is recorded and is on the MIMO website. It's a fascinating case study, and it literally, to amplify a little bit more, I can say more things than he can, because it's an affiliation director with McKinsey. But Chris Couch is a triple MIT, so undergrad, graduate, PhD, not in machine learning, literally picked up Machine Learning for Dummies, the yellow book. That's how he started, built out his whole team, his partner, and now Cooper Standard has spun that company out. They found it was so successful, they spun it out as a company called Livewire. And he's now the CEO of that company. So a really great case study to see, and it's a nice 30-minute video on the website that you really enjoy if you're into real-time process control.
Excellent, thank you.
And by the way, a similar circumstance where we've seen that happen is in things with like reaction furnaces, like smelting furnaces, where you want to optimize the output, and again, there's too much data coming off the line, and controls engineers can do their best, but machine learning algorithms tend to win out in a lot of those situations.
Yeah, you might want to just, while you're mentioning that, we did
Oh yeah, yeah. So in that same article, we talked a little bit about Vistra. So like, they run a network of power plants, and one of the things that they wanted to do is do it like it's called a heat rate optimizer. So the idea is how do you optimize the heat you put into the steam to turn the turbines, so that you reduce the energy or input energy, either coal or gas consumed to turn the turbine. And again, another situation where the thermodynamics are so complex that you can't actually solve the problem very easily, or it's too computationally intensive. Where machine learning, I can't remember if they use deep learning or not, but they were able to solve that challenge by applying ML. They got like an extra, I think, couple percentage points on a power plant, and it's tremendous impact in terms of efficiency of the facility, reducing greenhouse gas emissions, lowering the cost of energy.
Yeah, they provide power for 20 million households. They got a 1% savings, so that's 200,000 free households just by applying machine learning on top of all of their other models. So super powerful. Another shout out, podcast available. All this data is covered.
Yeah.
More data that's in HBR or the McKinsey.com is actually in the podcast, so you can listen to it on your drive home. More fun facts.
Yeah, absolutely.
Because the goal is we had 100 companies this year, 1,000 companies next year, so we're hoping all of you participate.
Thanks for the talk, Peter. Curious about perspectives on, as organizations scale, a centralized model or an embedded model for these analytics teams to influence operations?
So what we've been seeing is that the embedded model, you don't have enough people that know how to manage the teams. And so you get demotivated engineers, data scientists and engineers, if they don't have the right sort of mentorship and career path, right? Embedded with the teams. You need like a certain size of team to make sure there's enough there. So the centralized models, whether that's fully centralized or within a business unit, seem to be the locations where companies are having the most success. And there's variations between kind of the do-it-yourself crowd or I'm going to have ML engineers and data scientists that are really good at testing the viability of solutions that other companies are proposing that I purchase. And we see a combination of the two. Often core manufacturing processes where you have like a pretty unique production process, it's hard to buy off the shelf stuff. And so those engineers will work more on those solutions. Whereas if it's a more standard, a more common challenge, like every industrial facility in the world has motors or pumps, right? So you can buy more off-the-shelf solutions in those cases. It's just making sure that you have people in the company that can test if this thing's real or not, if it's going to deliver or not. So, and building on that, one thing that's super powerful in the centralized organizations is that they also have a huge motive for deployment. So you may prove a use case. I think we talked about a pharmaceutical company in one of our examples where they did like quality lab throughput improvement. So it's an automated algorithm to schedule your quality lab. And then that was highly replicable across every facility they had. So they made sure to copy exactly this program to every pharmaceutical facility they had in every quality lab, and they boosted the throughput in all those facilities.
When it comes to the size of the company or the industry, did you see the leaders cluster in certain size companies or certain industries versus others? Any stratification across those?
There were definitely more big companies, and I can't give the names of the companies that were the leaders, but you can imagine the big companies that might be in there. That being said, there are still smaller enterprises that were doing more like the buy model and executing. And there's a little bit of a scrappiness, I think, to the smaller companies, and that they're going to make sure that every dollar invested is going to go pretty far, and they may come up with some more unique solutions. There were lots of big companies in the planner bucket, as in they like invested a lot, but they didn't get the same results. So I think kind of embedded in your question is like, do you have to be big to be successful? The answer is not really. You can be big and unsuccessful or big and successful. And, yeah. Yep. Any other questions? Yep.
I didn't get a detailed look at the survey, but to what extent do you think it not validated, but I mean, company to company, are you getting consistent answers? To some extent, as a company invests, they have more people available to fill out surveys in detail, and maybe I mean, is there a good correlation with reality and survey, I guess? You know, if someone says they're doing predictive analytics, are they really, or do people not realize they're doing it in the field?
No, it's a good question. So when we one of the things we did is we actually talked to companies after they took the survey to hear more about the story behind their responses. And I think we spoke with 15-ish companies. And for the most part, what they told us, and we kind of pushed them a little bit, lined up with what they said. Now, it is all self-reported data, right? So we couldn't go and pressure test, like, did you actually improve 20% in your efficiency? But it passed the sniff test when we really pushed them. And so that was quite interesting. And we actually had multiple responses from the same company. Frequently, they were different divisions. And there was a little bit of like, there's actually differences in interpretation and reality within the same company at times, but they would be totally siloed. And I don't think they actually knew that the others were taking it. Question back there?
Yeah, I think this is sort of an add-on to the previous question. I mean, this is like a difficult onion to untangle, and I think we should maybe like apply Daisy's optimal random forest model or whatever to doing the causal analysis here. But I'm sort of curious if you looked at like absolute business outcomes for companies who were leaders. Like I have firsthand knowledge about companies who make big investments in analytics and machine learning to self-report that they're doing wonderful in that space. And it was obvious that the companies that were leaders had made those investments. And so one way to decouple that is like absolute business performance of those companies, which obviously you have to look at over time. But I'd be curious if that was a part of what you guys looked at.
Not yet, but that's like something that we're pretty excited to take a look at. So the way we're thinking about doing it is taking a look at like total shareholder return or stock market performance. Like we can't get, the way that the survey is structured, you can't really ask people to tell you like what was your profit before or after. And even sometimes tightly coupling the causal analysis between an ML and output is a little bit tougher. But that's a great question, something that we're looking to do as we continue the survey over the coming years. Along those lines, I'd love to go back to the playbook page if we could. Perfect. All right. So one of the things that we're looking to continue doing is the launch the survey again, likely back half of this year, and everyone who participated in the survey and participates in it going forward receives an implementation playbook. So if you took the survey last time around, these are coming. And then when we launch it again, if any of you are excited about learning a bit more, what you get out of participation is a playbook that benchmarks your responses against the entire data set. So detail around, for instance, how did you do against each of the enablers? What were your results against the broader data set? How does your strategy and which areas are you focusing on compare against a broader data set? And then also level deployment. So it's a pretty in-depth playbook, benchmarks you. We're excited to continue this partnership with MIMO and continue to explore how companies are being successful in this space. So if you're interested, reach out to me or Bruce, and we'll make sure to get you signed up for the next round of the surveys. Great. Well, no other questions. Thank you, everyone. It's been a pleasure.